getting here. And then I'll finish off with a few of my experimental curtal sonnets, which I've just been finishing, in fact, this week. So the overriding theme, I think, of getting here is about travel, wandering all over the place, and so on and so forth. So let me begin by having a quotation from Michael Ondaatje. What I am now was formed by whatever happened to me then, not by what I've achieved, but by how I got here. This is the poem, Getting Here. I have not asked for more than a quiet life in quiet times. That's a quote from J.M. Coetzee's Waiting for the Barbarians, and this is the poem. My father never explained his wanderlust. We did not discuss such things in our family. After every overseas contract ended, we headed back home for good. I came to learn for good never meant we'd be staying, as home grew more alien. Then we stopped going back. So home came to mean the countries we moved to. And for good, nothing but deracination, that permanent state of being l'étranger by language, custom, and unfamiliar diet. In all odysseys, the ancient theme recurs. Nostos, the coming home to one's hearth and kin after the outward journey's distant labors. All my arduous roaming has brought me here. And carrying on with that theme of journeys, the next poem is called Unfinished Things, and it has an epigraph by Theodore Roethke, the American poet. And the quote is, I dream of journeys repeatedly. Unfinished things. My journeys are not dreams, but memories, their persistence uncouth and disruptive, of ships and planes, departing with cargoes of ruptured lives, unfinished things, and pain of leaving for still stranger parts, places ordained to foster more remorse for deserting those I had come to love, always goading the urge to make amends. Going back to placate the delusions of nostalgia would never salve the wounds such travels caused, for time has changed too much, and those who were hurt should not be hurt again. As one of my favorite modus of travels is ship. I loved being on ships, and I remember from very early on in my life being absorbed by not only the ships themselves, but also by the ocean and the sea and its various moods and so on. And the next poem is called Small Waves, and it's about being along the beach side when we were living in East London. Small waves. In early morning mist, I walked northward toward the river mouth with its mussel-covered rocks and fishermen tied taut to the surf. Soft light spreads its golden luster onto the viscous lead-grey sea. Seagulls scythe the cold, opaque air. The sinuous mist starts to clear. I see just how small waves might wear away a continent in time. The modesty of their movement belies their determination. I walk this shore with deference, such persistence commands respect. And also continuing with the idea of being on the beach, just of late, it's been a problem that, being on the beach is somehow has its inherent human dangers now. And this is called Walking Along the Beach. And it has an epigraph from Susan Griffin. Because we think in a fragmentary way, we see fragments. And this way of seeing leads us to make actual fragments of the world. Walking along the beach. Waste bin. That we have homes in which we are cosseted from reality. Sad symbol of human stupidity, this debris is but a deceptive lure, hiding its terrible truth in plain sight. But the day will come when we'll have to search for answers that may never make amends. Too late for anything more than despair. Troubled by the thought of tomorrow's walk, I wend my way as best I can between used condoms, shell fragments, sea wrack, and junk. Then gash my foot on a broken bottle. Of course, one of the things that happens along the beach is the constant, fascinating movement of the sea and their perpetual moment and the movement all the time. And this is called perpetuum mobile, perpetual motion. Hardest to learn are the simple truths. Luminescent waves heave and curl towards the beach until they smash their salt green geometry on black rocks or seethe high up the sand, the wind trailing long tails of spume. Water, rock, and sand. Their presence here disguises millennia of slow mutation, their apparent permanence a reminder of our perfunctory days as we labor through our scarce decades to their assured end, when we mistake death for finality. And in a similar mode, this is called incessant movement. To write of the sea is to write of sky and light, of color and sound, of power to ruin, wreck, and flood, of wave-shaped shores with mist drifting slow from soft horizons, of the tide's pulse at the moon's beckoning, and a sense of the eternal, perhaps. In these vast sweeps of incessant movement, design and order must alter as they must, edges worn smooth, rocks pulverized to sand, dunes shifting shape daily at the wind's whim. This slow momentum abjures completion. No final forms, no lasting contours, just permutations of mutability. This poem is quite an interesting piece because the original structure of it didn't come from poetry at all. It actually came from music, and two pieces of music are involved. So if you'll let me indulge myself for a moment, I'm just going to mention those two pieces. The first piece is the opening movement of Benjamin Britten's first violin concerto, which begins with a motif which in music they call an ostinato, because it is repeated through and through and through with one small interlude right the way through to the end of the movement. So there is that sense of repetition. And I wanted to try and include repetition like that, to that effect, in a poem. The end itself, you're not going deaf when it quietens down, and I quieten down. It's based on the final movement of Mahler's Ninth Symphony, which is an adagio, and it is a very slow diminuendo into silence. And I wanted to write a poem which quietly fades away. And so that is the musical background to this poem, which is called The Refugees. Now it's time to leave again. We gather our stuff, hoping. Nothing has been forgotten in the urgency, hoping. We will remember always others left behind, hoping. Our memories are enough to keep us going, hoping. Wherever we are heading, we'll arrive safely, hoping that the further we travel, the fewer will die, hoping, hoping, just hoping, just. For a short while, I worked at a retreat near Ikopo, and it was very beautifully situated in the hills of Natal. And during one of the walks, out of the mist and so on, I was confronted by a very large white horse. I wasn't quite sure what was going to happen. And this is a poem about my confrontation with a white horse. It's called Winter Morning near Ikopo. Walking the uneven gravel path, we are cold, cautious. Forest pines snag the mist. In the soft, eddying snow, the road ahead is a weave of white and grey. Visibility measured in inches, where human geometries dissolve, and ears are more useful than eyes. Invisible streams go brawling down their narrow mountain runnels. The road quakes beneath approaching hooves. 6 dark shapes, ears, eyes, nostrils, and a colossal presence come to an abrupt halt of confrontation. So, this is Equus, wrought by the blue-haired god from the ocean's fury, authority and defiance plattered into every fiber, the incarnation of myth. Motionless, we stare quizzically at each other, his breath opalescent from flared nostrils. He remains tentative, poised for quarrel. Then he is done with us, aware that commingling with gods for too long deludes the human ego. A juddering snort and his pulverizing hooves thunder into motion to be quieted by distance and snow until all is white and seamless again. Having been to numerous retreats over the years, one of the main tasks, of course, is to sit at least once or twice a day meditating. And meditations are always interesting times because of the thoughts, ideas, whatever's that come to you. So there is a series of 10 pieces in the book called meditations, but they're not texts for meditating. They're texts that came to me while I was meditating. And from those 10, I'm going to read, I think I made it 2, but the other one is later. This is the first of the meditations. Morning snow feathers mountain and valley. We sit beneath the Buddha's downcast gaze. Every now and then, logs shift in the stove, the only sound, until the first gunshot. A heavy thud, then crass cheering from men who find some sort of pleasure in these things. They are killing baboons on the next farm, elation in every death. The dog's bark echoes through the pines across the river. We sit still beneath the Buddha's soft gaze this wintry morning as we meditate on the causes of the world's suffering. One of the things that happens as you get older is that you become more and more aware that the past is getting larger and larger and the future is getting smaller and smaller. And so one of the predominant themes that creeps into your work, or has crept into my work certainly, has been the process of aging and eventually of dying. And there are a number of poems that deal with that directly or indirectly. This is the first of them. The poem is titled That Day. My father always looked very peaceful when he was sleeping. Even those times over the years when he'd been ill, he slept despite the pain and the ravel of tubes. That day he was wearing a tailored suit, brown brogues and tie, knotted as it was when he went to work. That day he seemed happy, a small smile on his lips, his eyes tightly shut against the bothersome world, as they often were when he played the piano. That day, too, I would have liked to tell him how much I loved him when he was just himself and alive. In the next poem, the title becomes part of the first line, so I'm going to avoid repeating that for you. It's called The Beer Mug, which may start whetting a few appetites. The beer mug stands on the Welsh dresser, its cheery barrel shape, silver-plated, with 70 engraved on it. Tarnished and dusty now, it was my father's birthday present, 1988. He enjoyed a he enjoyed a beer with his Sunday braai. Sometime later, my parents joined a church, beer and much else, foregone in their search for salvation, or something similar. Living on borrowed time now, he'd said. At 72, his borrowing stopped. Point made, though, I never bought that idea. With its blue tarnish spreading like a slow bruise, The mug still stands on the dresser, unused, unlike my father's grave. In the process of traveling and getting here eventually, I've had the privilege of meeting all sorts of wonderful people in my time. And I met this gentleman at a rather boring academic conference, but he had a very interesting and very non-boring tale to tell, which he did. And this is a poem based on what he told us. There is a footnote to that, which I'll tell you about afterwards. It's called The Cyclist. And Ernest Hemingway wrote the epigraph. It is by riding a bicycle that you learn the contours of a country best, since you have to sweat up the hills and coast down them. The Cyclist. I once met a man who cycled across the States, taking photographs as he went, mostly of the usual stuff: mountains, rivers, quaint places, curious people. In one small town, he bought an old etching of a mountain he would soon be riding past. He found it, blown to smithereens by army guns for artillery practice. Further on, a forest raised to make way for dull suburbs packed with humdrum houses. These days, he pedals around the neighborhood, telling folks who ask that he couldn't do it again. He has the urge sometime, but lacks the stamina or the despair. The footnote was that when he got to the west coast of America, it was a summer vacation, the 3 months of academic relief, and trains, planes, any mode of transport, getting back from the west coast was made impossible because of all the holiday makers. So I asked him then, so what the hell did you do to get back to the East Coast? He said, I did the obvious thing. I cycled back. Sometimes I write and make notes on all sorts of strange things. I was once in a coffee shop and I had this idea, but for a haiku, but I didn't have any paper with me. I did have a pen. And so I wrote a haiku on the paper wrapper of the straw that they brought me with my milkshake. And I wrote several haikus subsequently on the paper wrappers of straws. But there are other places where you can also write whatever you fancy. This one is given away in the title. It's called Poem on a Paper Napkin. And A.R. Ammons, another wonderful American poet, has provided us with the epigraph. Visualize kitchen napkins scribbled with little masterpieces. I once wrote a poem for a friend. No one had written her one before. I scribbled some affectionate words on a paper napkin while we ate. Not long afterwards, she was transferred. We ran into each other again a year or two later in the mall. She was back visiting her family. She had a new husband, she told me, and she still had the poem as well. She liked to reread it now and then. Are you still writing poems? She asked. Not at lunchtime on napkins, I said. and we both laughed for different reasons. In the course of my time as an academic, I did spend a number of years working with the Grahamstown Foundation, which became the 1820 Foundation, I think. And there was quite a lot of traveling since I was based in Bloemfontein. And we traveled to Grahamstown or whatever it's called today, back and forth. And there were some sites that one could see as one shifted out of the geography of the Cape and moved into the geography of the Free State. And this is about that process. It's called On the Road to Bloemfontein, Early Morning and Mid-Year, 1989. The morning flaunts a primeval beauty as pyracantha berries smolder and glow red on bushes close to the highway's verge. Aloes flame and flare scarlet in the dry veldt, while pungent smoke from cottages and shacks wafts placidly toward distant grey hills until a vagrant gust swirls and shreds it. Tumbleweed cavorts wildly across a road that vanishes where sky and distance meet. We drive on through this haunting, craggy landscape to a flat region of far-flung koppies, awash with mirage of bright certainty. Early morning is no such time for things like this. The day's hazards lie ahead unseen, like snares. We've also been on several occasions to Philippolis, the home of Sir Lawrence van der Post, and we stayed at Van der Post House. And for those of you who know Van der Post House, at the back of Van der Post House, there is a wonderful labyrinth of the Cretan style made of brick. And at the side of it, at the time when I was there, there was a channel filled with water which flowed steadily through, and at night attracted the many frogs from the environs. And this is about a rather strange incident that took place in the title, One Night in Philippolis. From the flat countryside, evening rain, soft and quiet as snow, sidled into the village for the night. I was closing the curtains when I caught sight of movement outside. I held them open like a voyeur. In the streetlight's sodium glare, a youth stripped to the waist, well-muscled as a Roman statue, in tired surfing baggies, was walking the labyrinth, lithe and sinuous, but barefoot in the warm night. Reaching the center, he pirouetted several times with a liquid grace before bowing to an imagined audience. He made his unhurried way out into the night's ubiquitous drizzle and the street's radiant orange light. After that, I left the curtains open, but the day came for us to leave the youth, the dance, and the gentle rain. We go back to the theme of dying to some extent. Um, the epigraph comes from Pablo Neruda, another marvelous poet to read. Por cuánto tiempo muere el hombre? How long does a man spend dying? And so the poem is called To Be Good at Dying. As our days dwindle down, the seasons and Sundays, the unwandered reminders of time past or lost, of things yet to be done, pressure for completion mounting, words such as last and final acquiring granitic certainty, waiting to be chiseled on something to acknowledge that we were once here. So when the time comes, I hope I've learned to be good at dying, knowing how life's fabric rips and frays, the essential repairs purely makeshift and plain. I'll reach the threshold of that other mystery with some loose threads still strong enough for their purpose. Despite the body's scuff marks, the mind tries not to let its yarn break or tangle as it chronicles its defiance of time's capricious sleights of hand. The next poem was actually written on a New Year's Day many years ago. And I can remember exactly where I was standing at the time and so on. And it's called After the Chimes at Midnight. After the chimes at midnight, I wonder what retributions this year might crave, as its months and weeks and days lumber by. I make no more harebrained resolutions. They've never served like some redemptive pledge. I begin the year with both parents dead, their ubiquitous bric-a-brac still strewn around the house, devoid of all meaning. With the hooters, fireworks, and church bells done, the jollity, the screams, and sirens too, the clock hanging in the hall, now ignored, drips seconds into the passionless dark, like a leaking tap, its relentlessness, the ample measure of our slow dying. You may see that there was some preoccupation with death even in those times. As you travel, you meet all sorts of wonderful people, and then you come home and you tell your tale. And some people reflect on that situation now that they're back home. And this is a very short piece, only 6 lines, called Neither Here Nor There. Wherever you're living, you might well be thinking of just 2 things: reasons to stay and reasons to leave. Whichever you opt for, someone will be left behind. You remember too that I used the word nostos in the very first opening poem, the idea of the return to home and hearth after you've gone on your outward journey. And this is a little exploration of that term nostos, which is about why not to travel. There are many commonplace excuses for not going home again. Lack of funds, a displaced vertebra, fear of flying, the terminal's crush, waiting's tedium, old age's deep longing for quietude, the notion of nostos just abandoned. But if the truth be told, it's a simple wish, not to feel like an outsider again. Having been back, not back to England for a long time, but having been back once or twice, one becomes very aware of how alien you have become in your birthplace. You can't find your way around the streets. You look at all the new shops and supermarkets, the old railway station converted into the largest mall in Europe. All those strange things have uprooted you in a way from your past and altered your history for you. And you try and remember those things as they were when you remembered them, not when they were, you subsequently remembered them when they had been changed and damaged and altered beyond recognition. The other thing that traveling does with that in mind is that it leaves scars of various kinds. And this is a poem about that. The quotation is by Ted Talley. Our scars have the power to remind us that the past was real. As reminded of our retreating past, these hieroglyphs imposed upon the flesh point the doubting Thomases in our midst to palpable wounds, our history's truth. Inflicted by blunder or circumstance, illness or mishap, ourselves or others, few were chosen, some quite deliberate. We're all veterans of life's battlefields. There are certain days when we're less troubled by their presence than by uncertainty, as memory's details abscond or fade, bequeathing stitch marks and the suture lines. Scars, like photographs, prove that we've been here. Those more painful hide well below the skin. And this is the last poem of the book. I have 2 or 3 other short poems that I want to read afterwards, but this is the last poem. And I think Coda is the appropriate title for that, where it ties up a few of the loose ends about traveling. Coda. No matter where you travel, there will always be 1 or 2 threads, fine as spider web, strong as cabled steel, binding you to those places that have never let you leave, no matter where you find yourself now. The American poet Billy Connolly, who is a very entertaining writer, poet, he's also very entertaining in telling his audience to be aware of the 2-poem warning. That means they only have 2 more poems to get through. And he said, after that, you can hear them sigh with relief and pay you more attention again. Unfortunately, I'm not giving you the 2-poem warning. I'm giving you the 4-poem warning. So you could take a deep breath, sit back, and still relax. This is 4 of the most recent pieces that I've been writing, they're curtal sonnets. Curtal sonnets were invented by Gerald Manley Hopkins. And as in a typical Irish way, he said he wanted to create a sonnet that was 3/4 the length of the traditional sonnets, the Italian and the, in other words, 14 lines. He wanted to get 3/4 of that. One of the interesting problems that is attached to that is that 3/4 of 14 is actually 10.5. And I was amazed to discover, quite accidentally, that there's been quite a lot of academic, serious debate about what to call curtal sonnets' length. One clique says they consist of 10.5 lines. The other clique says, no, they consist of 11 lines with a shortened last line. So the 11 line versus 10.5 line debate, to the best of my knowledge, continues. The problem is with curtal sonnets is that you have to, if you write unrhymed poems, as I do, and rely very heavily on syllabic line length, syllabic count, you have to actually use even numbers of syllables for your lines. Otherwise, you face a very interesting problem. Your half line at the end of your curtal sonnet has to be, if you've written syllables of 11, it has to be 5.5 syllables. And I have yet to work out what half a syllable is. So these are curtal sonnets that don't rhyme, but do have, generally speaking, even numbered lines. However, the first one I'm going to read doesn't. It has 11 syllables in the line, and I cheat. I just use 5 syllables at the end to avoid getting caught in the academic crossfire. This is a series of 10, and then there are 2 new ones. Of the 10, this is number 7. All beginnings will have some sort of end, no matter how long or short the lapse between the two, whether days or decades. What lies ahead for every one of us is mere speculation against time's odds, the desperation of our hopes confirmed. We rarely notice mountains eroding or dry branches snapping off aging trees, or the river's flow eroding its banks. All we have to mind are our remnant days and death's certainty. This is number 9 of the first 10. As traffic gropes its way through morning fog, en route to the day's lackluster routines, who will hear the bell of quittance tolling when a life has come to stillness at last? For those left behind, there'll be no relief from their loss as they find grief becoming their lifelong companion. Without warning, recollections will inundate their days in the bewilderment of their new grief. Above the day's indifference, the bell tolls, still unnoticed. I might mention that the bell of quittance there is the bell that they toll for the funeral service. And in the traditional spiritual paths, the tolling was 6 tolls for, I don't know what is the politically correct term anymore, but female, lady, whatever. 6 bells for her, 9 bells for the man, both of which were followed by the number of years that they had lived. The bell would toll that number. I suppose you might not want to have a long-lived relative to listen to 101 bells tolling, but nonetheless, that is the bell of quittance. And the bell of quittance is used in a wonderful poem by Thomas Hardy called Afterwards, which uses the bell of quittance and has a wonderful opening line: when the present has latched its postern behind my tremulous stay. It's a wonderful poem right the way through. I now have just these last 2 curtal sonnets that were written and eventually completed in the last few days, week or so. This is number 11, and there will be number 12, and that will be the end. This is number 11. You said, I want to take you on a journey through my pain. I offer to travel with you. I'm no stranger to anguish and hurt, knowing the heart's suffering often goes unnoticed, the body's wounds quite evident in their scars. Dying's present in every sunset, in autumn, and every star that vanishes unnoticed. But why must there be such sorrow in our lives? Loss reminds us of all we might once have had and couldn't keep, and of what we cannot change. All journeys have risks. One poem warning. This is number 12. As I look back over most of a lifetime, I often wonder how I got to this age. And ever more bewildered, I wondered why. If much of our lives' hurt belongs to the past, why is it so hard to leave it behind? Regret can't rectify those years, nor should it be allowed to meddle with what we are now. We become what we learn from experience. When dawn rouses new, unpredictable days, every dusk draws the present into the past. Now is all we have. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Tony. Thank you. Getting a lot of emojis on people's screens. Thank you so much. That was beautiful. So we are going to move into the Q&A session. Are you happy for it to be recorded?
Yes.
Okay, cool. So if anybody has a question, you can just raise your hand and then I will give you the go ahead. Jock?
I'm not sure if you can see and hear me.
Yes, I
We
can.
can hear you. We can't see you.
Oh, what a pity.
Now we can see you.
You'd have seen me laughing and smiling and nodding through the reading. I enjoyed it very much. I'm fascinated by the ambivalence I pick up in your work. And I mean, I say ambivalence. I think it's a good thing. It's a productive thing between leaving home and going home. That there's something in you that wants to quit wandering in the way that your father did, and another part that doesn't. And I picked it up very much in that poem about the cycling academic. It was a wonderful. There was a wonderful line. I think it's my favorite line. That he can't set out on such a journey again because he lacks the stamina or the despair, and that's a wonderful. That's a wonderful. It's like a fork in the road, and it's either stamina or despair, but somehow you manage to take that fork in the road and go both ways. I wonder if you want to say something about that, how that how that works in your poetry. When you write, do you feel? I don't actually know what I want to ask. Do you find that a productive tension, let's say, in your poetry? Because for me, it's a very wonderful thing that I'm encountering there. That, as you leave, you want to stay, and as you stay, you want to leave.
Jacques, yes, that's a very interesting question. And I do have this, I've had this ambivalence all my life. Let me just give you a very quick overview, which you may not know. I was born in England. I did primary schooling in India and primary schooling in Sudan. I did high school in Kenya. I came to university in South Africa. I did postgraduate studies in New Zealand. I taught in Zimbabwe. I worked in Swaziland. And I spent quite a lot of time. I spent 3.5 months in New York. And I spent some time also in Poland. Yes, in all of those places, they have wonderful things which I've drawn on all my life. I would have never, ever missed my Indian days, especially.
Mm.
But at the same time, that constant sense of being uprooted, of you make friends at primary school, and then your father comes home and said, the contract's over, Anthony, we're going back to home in 2 weeks' time. And all that India meant to me is just ripped away.
Mm.
So they are at the same time provisioned, they've provisioned me with wonderful experience, and they've hurt like hell. And it's and that's why that's why I've still got the scars.
Yeah. And is poetry a way of going back? Can poetry help you to go back to those places?
Yes.
Mm.
You can't. One of the huge problems of aging is that you discover that your past is much longer than your future, and the result of that is that you look back on it and you start evaluating it. You start trying to understand why what happened, so that you can come to terms with some sort of relief for the hurt, but at the same time, you don't want to sacrifice all the positive things that grew out of those experiences. Some of the experiences were absolutely extraordinary, and I would never have missed those. But at the same time, suddenly being uprooted again and turning into what I've called l'étranger, the stranger again. You're the stranger in every new environment. And so there is a certain sense pervasive to this day that I have an unsettled life. I worked out the other day that I've actually moved house and home, both inside South Africa and internationally, almost 60 times. And you get to the point where you're just fed up with it. You want to sit back and know that nobody's coming in with the damn contract to say, we're going home or disappearing some other place. But
Yes.
it's a lovely, but it is in that ambivalence. I think it's also the ambivalence between life and death in the
Yes.
end. The big issues, those are the two, as Jung called them, the two great mysteries. So this ambivalence, I suppose we should expect because of that ambivalence. We
Yes.
don't know why we're born and we don't know why we die,
Mm.
but we do
Yes.
both.
Yes. Thank you.
No, it's a great pleasure.
Thank you, Jacques. There's a Michael, but I'm assuming that okay. I'm assuming this isn't Michael, but Michael.
So it's Michael's wife, Steph, speaking. And
Hi,
Tony,
Steve.
hi, thank you. Tony, of all the poems that you've read this evening, the one that really deeply moved me was the one about the refugees, finishing with the line, just hoping. And I'm curious about the writing of that poem, the time of the writing of that poem, and was there a particular group of refugees that motivated your writing of that particular poem? Thank you.
Thanks for that. It's a very interesting question. I wasn't motivated by any particular group. I think, as I was saying to Jacques just now, I almost feel like a refugee sometimes, just moving around, saying, I wish I could stop and stay somewhere. And I would have loved to have stayed in England perhaps all my life, but I'll never know. So I just wondered what it would be like, what it's like to be a refugee, desperately hoping for better things. Hope. I can't imagine what a refugee, and I had never been a refugee, but I can't imagine how they can get on without hope. There must be somewhere conscious or unconscious that drives them on, hoping. And I suppose in a certain sense, I was also hoping that my father would stop coming back with contracts saying we're going back home. But the poem, as I mentioned, really materialized out of listening to the structure of Mahler's symphony and Benjamin Britten's violin concerto. It came out of my love of music rather than out of any particular refugee situation. And I was playing around, experimenting with trying to get the refugees quietly disappearing. I do remember when I was at boarding school, this would be about 1960, the school term was shortened by 3 weeks, and we had to sacrifice our hostel rooms to the refugees that were coming out of the Belgian Congo. And we had to say that because most of them were French speaking, the one or two of us who were studying French were, I suppose, cajoled into helping them with our very bad French to just try and get around. My boarding school was in Nairobi, so just to help them get around shopping and doing that sort of thing. And they told horrendous stories of upheaval. And I have relatives who were chased out of Zimbabwe with 24 hours notice and had their dogs shot in front of them. But somehow they managed to go on. And that tenacity is something which is absolutely remarkable as far as I'm concerned. And it also builds, obviously, a lot of ill feeling as well. And I was actually playing with musical forms. I often hear music and say, I want to write a poem like that. Right, and then I've got to rummage around and try and find a subject matter somehow. But that's how they came about.
Thank you so much.
Letu, and then we can have Sulky.
Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yes, we can.
but not now.
Yeah, Letu, we could hear you, and then you went quiet.
Can you hear me now?
Now I can hear you.
Yes, now we can hear you.
No, I was wondering something related to the previous, what you said previously about constantly being uprooted. I can attest to a similar type of upbringing, but I maybe had a different reaction to it, which is that I became very afraid of what happens to the people who stay, and seeing what staying in a place does to a person. And I'm just wondering if you've had a similar sort of dread of being kept in one place and becoming of that place, and yeah, just becoming like the people who remain.
Yeah. I think I tried to capture that in the very last poem, The Coda, where I said there will be one or two threads binding you to the places that have never let you leave. And the point of that was that I still buy Indian music. And I left India 60 years ago, 70 years ago. There are still things about India which I remember on a daily basis. And I wonder also, as part of just being human, what happened to those people in many ways? What about the people who were on our staff and now we left them? Where did they go? What happened to them? And so on. The problem is, and it's a heartbreaking problem, that life goes on and reality sometimes gets in the way of wish fulfillment. And that, and of course you worry about it. I had relatives in various parts of the world who were in very dire circumstances, political circumstances. You worry about them, but individually, it's very difficult to do something about them. I know, in fact, I've got family tonight listening from Scotland. It would be lovely to be there with them instead of sitting here in Port Elizabeth. But, circumstance, we have to live within the circumstances of life. And those can be extremely frustrating, extremely hurtful. And some of the pain we will never recover from. And we shouldn't expect to recover from that pain, because really, in the end, therein lies the richness of the experience. The pain is part of the experience. And that's why you treasure the experience more. I don't know whether that answers your question.
Sorry, I'm having technical issues, but yes, thank you.
Thank you, Letu. Is it Sulky or Sulk? I don't know. I feel like I'm mispronouncing everybody's names this evening. But I told Ed I'm so bad.
I'm very unfussy. You can say Silky or Silka or Silka, just as you wish. It doesn't matter to me.
Thank you, Sulka.
Thank you. I'm going to try and appear out of politeness, courtesy, but my bandwidth is very low. So can you hear me like this?
I can.
You can.
Yes.
Okay, thank you for a very, very, I will say, journey inviting read of poems. Two questions. The one is very simple. The poem set in Philippolis about the pirouetting labyrinth walker. Is that also from the volume Getting Here?
Yes.
Okay. And then the real nitty question is actually a language question, because I noticed that you repeatedly said that your father said we are going back home, but in fact you did not go back anywhere. You went, one could say, forward to somewhere else. And in regard to the poems that you presented tonight on your preoccupation with death, I wanted to ask, I find myself asking, with the going back home, but going in fact forward, or maybe forward is the wrong word as well, to an unknown new home, as it were, how would you speak? How would you put language to, could one say that going back home to homes that you've never been before is almost like going back to death? Because going back home is like going back to birth. And do we go forward to death? So in terms of the language that is being used for home and going back, going forward, I don't know if you have anything to say about that, if I've made sense. It's not so much a question as a question mark that I'm putting out about how do we use language to talk about this journeying, and what Jacques had said about the ambivalence between leaving and, you know, returning. Maybe it's got something to do with that. So, but yeah, just how do we speak the going back home to a home you don't know? That really confused me, I suppose, from a language point of view. If you could say something about that.
Yeah. Hi, Silke. Nice to see you again after all these years. I think the problem is that the language, the poems raise the question of what constitutes home, as well as the newness moving forward. Where are you moving forward to? And eventually that has to become your new home. But the old home doesn't get forgotten because it's lodged in the memory. And it's the memory. Let me put it this way. I have another book coming out later called Walking Around a Hole in the World. And it's from Edna St. Vincent Millay. And one of the things she says there is that there's this hole in the world when you've lost somebody, as you will well know. And what do you fill that hole with? And the only thing that I've been able to work out that you can fill that hole in the world with is memory. And that's a reminder of the various kinds of home that you've lived in. They were all home at the time, and yet they turned out to be failure as home because you moved out of them, you moved on. But moving on implies that process. And it's very bewildering in the end. I don't know where I belong, quite honestly. I'm here now in Port Elizabeth, but 4 years ago, I was here in East London and things have just changed. Circumstances do change, and I have no idea how I would define what constitutes home. It's the place where I'm at the time. And that's why the idea of the refugees resonated with me so much, that it would have been nice in sometimes for a life where you grew up in the place you were born and you died in and were buried in the cemetery in your hometown. That would be quite nice in some ways, but at the same time, I would never have missed all the experience that I've had in traveling. So it's a trade-off, one against the other, and the language has to be able to try and cope with that in the best ways it can. But I know that at the same time, the language is limited because we're required to use those same words like home and away and forward and backwards. And we live in an either-or world rather than a both and. You can't have both and moving backwards and moving forwards. Although you will remember Ram Dass did say once upon a time, standing nowhere is perfectly safe.
Yes, yes. Well, that's perhaps why the gestural poem of the person in the labyrinth, almost mythical image that you create there, very, very theatrical. But maybe that stood out for me because he wasn't going anywhere. So in the order of the presentation that you gave, that is almost as you know, the pirouettes are almost the axle of the wheel.
Yes, I mean,
Thank you.
I think the reality is that the labyrinth is a very potent symbol for me in many ways, because the way in and the way out are one and the same. In the Cretan labyrinth, certainly. The problem with that is that if birth was your way in, then birth should be your way out, but it isn't. Death is. And so the point is your journey in the labyrinth one where you go in, get to the center and come out, or do you get to the purpose of your journey when you arrive the first time at the center? So there's this wonderful ambivalence even about the labyrinth, that you may regard the center as at last I'm here, or on the other hand, I'm going to have to leave this behind. Otherwise, I won't get out of it. So it's that, I think ambivalence is such a potent image, a word that we can use, I don't know exactly, because, you know, to going forward, going back, being here, being there, wanting, I didn't want to get particularly old, but I've got particularly old. And so I've got this ever-growing past to cope with. But my daily focus is on tomorrow, today and tomorrow. But I need both. I don't need an either-or option. For me, it's a both and complexity. My Indian father would always talk to me about these opposites, the good, the bad. They're not miles apart. They're two sides of the same coin. And that's the currency with which we have to live. And ideally, we achieve this balance by sitting on the edge with the coin standing on its edge. But that's not reality. That's the ideal. And the coin will fall one way or the other. And then you have to pick it up and start all over again to try and get it to balance. And I understood that to be part of the lesson of life itself.
Thank you. If you haven't listened to Elephant Revival's Home in Your Heart, see if you can't find it. It's one of my favorites.
I'll do that. Thank you.
Ed and then Toka.
Hey, Tony. Thank you.
Hi, Ed.
Hi. Good to put a face to the name. and to
Yes,
hear you read
quite.
finally.
Yes, yes, and it's lovely to be able to reciprocate as well.
Hey, a lot of thoughts going through my head, as I'm sure many people did. Mainly appreciative thoughts about just the nuanced, layered, the probing, reflective quality of the writing, and the truth telling in the writing, and the care that you take with your choice of epigraphs, and the conversations that are there with the poems in those choices. And I love the title. I think it manages to, because of all the resonances with all these journeys, the aging, travel, etc. So if I have a question, it's to do with that title and how it perhaps informed the book, or if it's just one of the organic things that came out of the many journeys of the writing. Yeah, it's such a great title. And where can we get your books is my other question.
Well, let me deal with what I can the easy answer first. You've got my contact details. You contact me and I can let you have the direct details of how to get hold of the books. You get hold of them through me.
Right.
That's the point. So just contact me and I can get you in touch with the books. Yes, in fact, I spend more time than it is really necessary fiddling with titles. Titles are a crucial part of the creative process for me. And I didn't have a title for this book for a long time. It was just poems that I think I was just remembering the other day, I think I was actually going to call it Book 2. Because out of sheer desperation that I couldn't make up my mind about the titles, but I think titles have got to be attractive to the reader. It's got to pull the reader in to want to go into the book. And getting here raises the question of where are you talking about? And that's always been my reality, you know. Where am I talking about? Where am I a citizen of, having traveled the world like I have and lived here, there, and everywhere? Where do I belong? Everywhere I've gone, I've been an outsider, a person who doesn't speak the language and doesn't belong to the culture. But I wanted to sort of capture the idea that regardless of all that, you would keep going. And at this present point in my life, I'm here. And so I've got here. And these are the things that I remember about getting here. But that doesn't mean I'm living here or staying here. It means I've got here, if that makes sense to you.
Yeah, there's an interesting tension between getting and here. So
yes, and also the getting and going again. You know, I've moved so many times in my life that I sit here at my age now worrying, perhaps slightly facetiously, but worrying about, am I going to have to move again? Where am I going to have to move to this time? Where am I going to be the outsider one more time? So that was, it was meant to raise that sort of issue, the title, that it doesn't actually answer the question, with any of my questions. It's just a statement of, this is where I'm now. And I'll do the best to live as full a life as I can, given the vicissitudes of age. I don't know whether that really answers your question, Ed.
It does. Thank you. It does.
Be in touch about the books.
Will do.
Thanks.
Hi
Thank
all.
you, Ed.
Mr. Ullyatt. Oh, okay, go ahead.
No, you can go, Toka. It's okay. I was just saying thank you to Ed.
Oh, you've somewhat prophetically answered my question, in your previous answer. I will ask it in case you have something more to add. But I too have an experience of moving around, however, not to as many countries. And I was interested in the list of places that you've lived, are often inhabited by people who find a sense of home quite grounding, and multi-generational, which is something that I see, from what you've said. You seem to limit it to your experience individually. How has your experience of home interacted with the people you find in India, in Kenya, in South Africa, in Swaziland, in Zimbabwe, whose sense of home seems to transcend their or our individual lives? And then I just wanted to have a comment as well. Your description of that the horse and the snow is quite lovely. My son has recently taken up a liking to horses, and I think that I appreciated the way that you expressed the characteristics of that horse. But yes, how has your experience of home interacted with the experience of home of the people who were locals, of the people that you would have been an outsider to throughout your life? Thank you.
I think it's a very important question that you're raising, because it's how does somebody with a culturally different background find ways to fit in with the culture in which they suddenly find themselves. Generally speaking, I would say that those experiences of fitting in were easier when I was younger, obviously. Children learn languages much easier. So learning basic Hindi in India and Arabic in Port Sudan it just came to me. You just acquire it somehow as a child. Adults don't do that to the same extent, and that's one of the handicaps. But I've been fascinated. I've regarded every place that I've been in as an education, something to learn from. Knowing that I come as an outsider, I may remain an outsider, but to fit in to the culture enough to learn as much as possible about it, to enrich my life, to open my mind further. I mean, education doesn't stop with degrees and things. Education is a lifelong process. And all those places were hugely important in shaping what has now become this old man. That's what happens. Some people go there, and I know quite a lot of people in countries want to go and find their particular kind of food. The English are notorious for going to France and looking for fish and chips instead of tasting escargot or something like that. So I go there with an absolutely open mind. I try to be as unbiased as possible so that I can be filled with whatever available, whatever comes to me. In India, for example, my teachers were Indian-speaking people. They spoke Hindi. We had to learn Hindi at the school. But there was this vast range of experience with the people that I've met in various countries. That's been an education. It's not been learning to get a qualification or whatever. It's been an experience which I've done my very best, not always successfully, but I've done my best to try and learn what that does in terms of shaping my thinking, of my feeling, to educate myself as a human being. I don't know whether that really answers your question, but
it has. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Toka. Mary?
Okay. I don't know if you can see me. Can you hear me?
I can.
Right. Oh, sorry, I always seem to mess this up here. Okay, I don't know if you can see me because I can't see myself on the screen.
I can see you as well, Mary. Thank you.
Okay, it has been quite riveting, listening to you. So many thoughts have come up. So it's been very stimulating. And yeah, I could enter into such a dialogue with you. There's so much. I think we all could. You've just. It's been a fantastic kind of dialogue, a potential for dialogue, which maybe that's a nice title. But I also one thought that came to mind when you were talking about titles was if you know the book, if you meet the Buddha on the road, then kill him. So I sort of thought, well, if you meet an existentialist on the road, talk to him, because it's kind of an essay in existentialism, all your poems together. It's quite amazing. But one little question I thought was when you read the White Horse poem, your walk in Iklopo, and the line, until all is quiet and seamless, until all is white and seamless again. And just then, having heard the whole session, I just wondered if that was a reflection of your kind of cultural being sort of uncomfortable in a culture, or say in the Eastern Cape, amongst the Amaxhosa, and then seeing this horse and then going back to white and seamless again. I wondered if that was a metaphor for a sort of cultural discomfort, and what year that was that you wrote that, and where you were in South Africa politically at the time. Yeah, that's it,
well,
really.
all right. Mary, it was in 2007. The year was 2007.
Oh, okay, so quite recent.
So it's quite recent. And
Yeah.
Because of my background, I know I'm invested with a particular biological makeup, skin color, but I don't find it easy to stick to those. It has nothing to do with politics. I have little or nothing to do with politics unless I'm looking for a joke and some entertainment. So there is a certain fascination at the moment with Donald Trump because he makes me laugh so often. But I'm very open to exposure to educate myself. As I was saying earlier, I don't want to be anything. the horse was white because the horse itself was white in the experience that we had that morning, and there was a sense of being in that part of the country with the beautiful landscape and very much of it untouched. Meant there was still a kind of pureness, a purity about the place.
Mm-hmm.
But it was nothing, not a political statement of any sort. I have never written a political poem that I can, and I never have the urge to. I've written some satirical things which I would never allow published, but no, not in that sense.
Okay, no, it's just that thought crossed, just because when I heard you reading the poem, I did just connect it with the landscape, going back to white. You know, it was that's how. But then subsequently, having heard about all your sort of cultural, you're traveling and feeling like the stranger. I just wondered if that did have a kind of a feeling of going back to something that you knew. You know, that was white and seamless again. It was your culture. But no, but you have explained it, so I'm not querying that at all.
No, what happened was that I had, in my research many years ago, I was also quite involved in the role of mythology in poetry. And so the whiteness was the pureness of the horse as an epitome of a mythological creature. The whiteness, I was confronting echoes directly from myth. And myth has that aged quality to it. It's an ancient kind of history. And so in that almost primitive landscape too, untouched, undamaged, it was, how we say, more a mystical experience than anything political.
Yeah.
It had a kind of purity about it, which was quite extraordinary.
That's a beautiful poem.
Made a huge impression on me. You know, this massive beast just emerging like this out of the mist and the snow.
Yeah.
But where we could look at each other and there was no hostility. So there was that mythic quality to it as well.
That's amazing. And
there's
this one last thing, so I don't hog the screen here. I've just finished reading The Beekeeper of Aleppo.
Oh, yes.
Have you heard that book?
I've heard of the book. I haven't got it.
It's an amazing tale of a refugee's journey from leaving Syria and arriving in well, I shouldn't tell you the end of it, but it's and it's
you mean elsewhere?
Yeah, elsewhere. And his quest for home and finding home, and how he finds it on arrival. It's a beautiful story.
I'll remember that.
Yeah,
I'll remember that. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. And I'd like to get a copy of your book as well.
If you ask somebody like Ed, he's got my phone number, and then
that's good.
You can contact me directly.
Thank you.
We'll make a plan.
Thank you. Thank you for the evening.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Mary. I think that we will call the Q&A now. So we will take a short 5-minute break, and then we will come back for the open mic.